coming to the second installment of our colloquium this year on capitalism. I'm pleased to introduce Walter Licht from the Department of History here at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Licht received his BA from Harvard and PhD from Princeton. And he is a sort of foundational figure in both shaping the field and participating in the field of what is called the new labor history. His early work focused, his first published work focused on the organization of labor in the railroad industry. From then, he shifted to questions of how labor was organized in industrializing Philadelphia, to broader questions of 19th century industrial America. His most recent book, published, let me get the title right here, The Fate of Decline, the Pennsylvania Anthracite Region in the 20th Century, won the Merrill Curdy Prize for Best Book in Social History. It was published in 2005. And since then, he has been working on a much larger volume on the role of American capitalism in sort of the global development of capitalism, of which he will present today. So, we are pleased to introduce him.
I prepared a PowerPoint on my screen with the darkest background color ever, assuming I need to project it and it's not showing up. So could we close some lights? Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right.
You can close that one too.
No, I need it myself. So you'll eat in the dark and listen to me. Okay. You've got all that, and I'm going to start off with some for starters. Does everybody hear me? I think this is mic'd up. Okay, but I tend to wander around. For some starters, yes, reflections, that's in the title. This will not be your traditional academic presentation. I will not be name dropping. There will be at best skirting reference to a few social theorists and scholars. This is a personal odyssey that I've been through, and I'm relating a personal odyssey. Okay, so I certainly could pull off the top of my head any number of people to cite. It's not going to have that academic quality, this presentation. So to the end of the personal odyssey, I'm going to provide a brief autobiography. I knew some people were working here on my, a little bit of an intellectual biography here, but I'm going to add some to it. And my purposes here is I think it will actually provide some content and background for my remarks. And this reflection, is it time to abandon the term capitalism here? For those who are interested in my biography, this will add a little more grist to what you just heard. So I'm going way back. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York in the 1950s. I grew up in a family of political radicals and trade union organizers. I was spoon-fed Marxism, current events, and a good deal of history at the dinner table. It is a little phrase for a person like me, a red diaper baby, if you've heard it. You often use this expression in classes today, and most students, current undergraduates, have no idea what I'm talking about. But anyway, you get that context. There are two other aspects beyond this spoon-feeding that I got that actually do speak to my few, Van Hood, I can imagine it, scholarly career, as you will see as I go through this little trajectory. Reading was greatly promoted in my family and vigilantly by my mother, and I did become a prodigious reader and still am. And I will note here, when we can talk about what do historians do that might be a little different than anthropologists and other social scientists, I tell you, the love of reading is, I think, a prerequisite for becoming a historian. The other thing that happened was, and this is unusual, I think, for a child, I got fascinated with work sites. This had a good deal to do with my other parent, my father, who was an architect, who would take me to construction projects that he had been a designer of, and I just loved watching what was going on and quite fascinated by it. Earning money during my high school teenage summers as a busboy and waiter also played a role in this fascination with work. In fact, I worked in some large hotels and kitchens, and I wasn't very good at it because I would stop and just watch, because I love the choreography of the kitchen. I loved watching what was happening formally according to the rules and regulations, and a great deal that was not happening formally, but very, very informally. And I actually, as a teenager at this point, thought to myself, and I'm not making this up, that if I ever studied anything, I think I would study work. This, I don't think, is what my parents at that point would have wanted to be, or pressed me to study. I think they would have preferred that I studied working people's political mobilizations and trade unionism. You'll see how this follows up, this little thing about work. And it reminds me of an old quip, a very old quip that says, "I love work, I can watch it for hours." That's true. I do love work and I can watch it for hours, but I actually love work. I love my work as scholar, educator, teacher, and colleague, which takes me into such venues as this place with wonderful fellow colleagues here. This early history of the spoon-feeding of Marxism and other radical thought, spoon-feeding a lot of current events and an awful lot of history, this love of reading, this fascination with work, did not play out at all in my college education, I have to say. I entered college imagining myself as either a future poet or a biologist. Very quickly, neither of them worked out. I was incompetent in both. So I did major in history as default. That was the easiest thing to do. But this is the 1960s, and people ask me what I majored in. I majored in protest. That's where I spent my activity hours. The causes and crises of the 1960s, though, did lead me to pursue, to at least apply to, and then enter a PhD program in sociology. And I did this at the University of Chicago, and what an incredible place to be to study sociology. It was just the masters were there. And at least on my application, I said I was interested in pursuing specifically sociology of work or sociology of education. I only stayed 1 year in that doctoral program. The draft, this is 1968, my draft board was breathing down my neck, telling me to show up for induction. And meanwhile, I had written them relentlessly that I would refuse induction. I did then, was able to secure a substitute teaching license, and it proved to be an escape from the draft here. So I began it 4 years, and a very, very important years of my life, as a fourth grade teacher in a public school in Harlem. As I said, this is really, in my personal intellectual maturation, one of the most important parts of my life. I did gain a lot, though, from my 1 year at Chicago working with masters, which would influence what would happen beyond, which I wasn't imagining while I was a public school teacher. One, I did immerse myself in reading in social and economic theory. I did a lot of that. I also became, because it was required, a pretty skilled computer programmer and pretty skilled in statistics. And ultimately, a lot of my work as a historian would have a deep quantitative edge, so there was some payoffs. But at the point I was doing it, I never knew what the actual payoffs would be. So I taught for 4 years and then decided I would return to graduate school, but definitely not in sociology, and made the decision to apply and pursue a PhD in history. This is an involved story, I kind of think an interesting one. And the short version is the following. In that deep immersion into social and economic theory that I did in Chicago that 1 year, I got really impressed by how some of the venerable greats in social theory, actually had read a hell of a lot of history and knew their history. I would learn subsequently that some of them were kind of crappy historians, Max Weber being one of them. But I was impressed that they couldn't conceptualize and theorize without that base knowledge of history. And I really felt strongly, and I still do, that if I ever was going to conceptualize at a high level, I'm not sure I've even gotten there yet, I am going to have to jump deep into the muck of history. And that's why I decided to pursue a history degree rather than a sociology degree, which kind of started at the conceptual level and begged and borrowed pieces of information they got from historians. I was going to go from the bottom up rather than from the top down. So I pursued doctoral studies in history. I concentrated in U.S. economic history. And then what I termed, my teachers at the time didn't even know what I was talking about, what I called at the time the history of work and labor markets. And in some ways there's kind of a real consistency here. The titles are mentioned, I'll show you the book titles, in the products that have come subsequently in my life here, and I'll just say briefly about it. Working for the railroad, the organization of work in the 19th century, came from my readings about the pioneer role the railroad companies played in introducing bureaucratic techniques of management. They are the first large-scale bureaucracies. Just to give you an example, by the way, in 1875, the Pennsylvania Railroad, centered right here, had 75,000 employees. The largest mill had 250 at this point. The average workshop had 8 people in 1975 in Philadelphia. So these are pioneers in bureaucracy, and I was curious, what is it like to work in these large-scale institutions? And there's some interesting findings there that I learned that a lot of the bureaucratization and call for rules and regulations actually came from below, not from on top. We can talk more about it. That was followed by some studies in Philadelphia, and this is co-authored in a wonderful exercise. I love this. This is a photographic history of the industry here, and it's called Work Sites. And it really we found over 700 photographs here, which go into the interiors of the workshops and mills and plants in Philadelphia in the period of 1890 to 1950. Again, there's work, and interested in work sites. And then there's a book called Getting Work, Philadelphia, 1840 to 1950, which really is, there are not many like this. This is a study of the history of the evolution of labor markets. So there it is. You know, there's a lot of continuity here. I had made a certain mark, and I was commissioned to write a text on industrialization called Industrializing America in the 19th Century. And then I won't go into how I wound up in the 20th century looking at the other end of economic development and the question not just of industrialization but deindustrialization, and studying a region where there was enduring economic decline, the Pennsylvania anthracite region not far from here. But it followed up with great interest. I love miners. I've lived in mining communities, and I love how the structure of work in these communities creates a culture of work as well, and a cultural community, and that really is why I decided to go to mining. You see there's some lines here, which I find interesting in just even thinking about it here. And I'm going to say a little about it. The last thing is, and this is also commissioned, someone said, well, you've looked into the interior of things, why don't you look at the kind of global dimensions of what you study? And that's taken me into this work, which I hope is done in the next year and a half, American Capitalism and Global History. But I have something to say there because this book is not what you think it is not what my publishers think I've been writing about. So more about that to begin with. So that's a little more grist for the intellectual biography. And now go back to for starters here, the big question, why? And maybe why some of you even gathered here. And the subtitle of this, is it time to abandon the term capitalism? Reflections of a Historian. And I prepared a little blurb on it. Why am I now in this stage of my life suggesting that we relinquish the term capitalism? Okay, and I will progress into that. Just since it's been a personal odyssey, there's been a personal quality to it. So number one, I will say I have not one who has not used the word capitalism. I've bandied it about, invoked it throughout my scholarly career. A lot of it has to do with History 161. This is a course, I told Greg Urban, I'm now in my 42nd year at the University of Pennsylvania. I think the first time I taught it was 1979. It was actually called the History of the U.S. Economy. And I discovered in 2 years, if I just changed the title to American Capitalism, I could triple my enrollments, which it did, and it sustained triple those enrollments. Advertising here. Anyway, I've been teaching a course I love, I adore. It's a very successful course. If you look at student lectures, numbers, I've had one of the students emerge out of this course, and I'm glad to say there is a young scholar who's just joined us as an assistant professor last week, unpacked her books, who does Brazilian political economy, who took this course as a freshman in 2004, 2005, I'd have to look, I got straight A's. And she hugs me and says, I'm here because of this course, even though it had nothing to do with Brazil. And there's several stories there. Anyway, I've been teaching it for a long time, and at a certain point, I was very, very glad that students didn't press me on how would I define capitalism? Because I discovered myself in doing this course, and it was involving hard-pressed, if pushed, to have to define capitalism. And that made a decision for me about 7 or 8 years ago to fess up to my students and actually use part of that course to interrogate this term. So the course has shifted in interrogating the term, and it's raised issues in my mind. Maybe I should even stop interrogating it and just abandon it. So History 161 has a lot to do with this, which I've been doing now for a long, long time, and still love it. The second thing is something emerged about 10 years ago in the history field, largely among young historians. They brought me into the panels as the elder statesman, called the History of Capitalism, or the New History of Capitalism. And this became a well advertised and discussed new enterprise in the history department. So well advertised that it was a front page story in the New York Times about 5 years ago. It has a bunch of gurus and Pied Pipers who are good 20, 30 years younger than I am. And I've smiled. It's a nice kind of return to what I would call a materialist kind of history. So in the face of that, publishers began asking me to evaluate manuscripts of these young scholars. And you'd read the introductions, and I discovered in book, and these are wonderful studies. I mean, the actual empirical work is just fabulous. I discovered in their introductions, it was like the plague. Whenever they had to define the word capitalism, they ran away from it. The vaguest things. And it was like they ran away from the plague. Then two publishers gave me both 25-page proposals for a series on the history of capitalism, or the history of new capitalism. I won't mention the presses, but they are high-end presses. I read them and got back. I said, I just can't believe this. In 25 pages, these proposals do not define what they mean by the term capitalism. People run away from it like the plague. And that also made me think. It's a wonderful enterprise, the new history of capitalism. I like it. I think people in the seminar will read a couple pieces, pretty critical, about it. I love it. I love going to the panel and sitting there as the elder statesman. It's very hard to know what they're doing, frankly, because they're not defining the term. And in some ways, it's very presentist. They're faux pas historians. When you're a graduate student, you're told not to be presentist. And that is to think about what's happening now and think you can read it back into history, and you can't. The thing that's going on here is it's presentist. It really is a function of the global financial collapse of 2006-07 and the subsequent economic decline, which we're still living in many places here. And it tends to be, if you look at the titles, the subject matter, it's sort of the underbelly of the economic system. So there's a lot of works on panic, financial panics, on debt, on business failure, on risk. They're great works, really empirical works. And I guess maybe they belonged under this rubric of the history of capitalism, but to me, they're sort of, oh, there's one great book on counterfeiting. They're kind of the underbelly of economic activity. I think, to me, they're a mark of these young people in graduate schools finding subject matters in the midst of this global economic crisis here. So that's what pushed me forward, but the big thing that pushed me forward, and I want to do this briefly, is this commission to think about what I had written about globally, doing a global history. And originally, it was really to be 19th and 20th century center. And I discovered I wanted to go way back in time here. And the more I went way back in time, and I literally go back 5,000 years in the study, as I will still show you. I'll show you in a second very briefly. I discovered that this term was of no use whatsoever, capitalism. Because if you took some of the elements of capitalism, what you think the elements of capitalism, existence of markets, the role, economies based on the forces of supply and demand, the valuation or sanctity of private property. You can go on and on. I will go on. I can be in ancient Mesopotamia. I can be in ancient Rome. I could be in Venice in the 1400s. I can be Great Britain in the 1700s, and it looks like capitalism if you stick to the definitions. When wasn't there capitalism? Becomes the issue. And to me, this is just so ahistorical, taking concepts and think they characterize what you're reading about the past. And that's really when I began to think, what if I write this history without using the word capitalism? At least announcing that up front, which I do in my introduction here. And it's hard, by the way. It's something that is so easy to invoke. It is often invoked, as I said in this blurb, talismanically, without even thinking. Glibly, ahistorically. I took that as my challenge here. So the title of this book is A Little Bit of False Advertising. And it's all explained in the introduction of this book here. And it's not been easy, and I'm not sure I'm right, so I'm offering this as reflections, and particularly as reflections for the start off of a colloquium that is battling with capitalism here. So these three things began to put in my mind, including my inability, if pressed by my own students, to define it, to try to write without it. So the next thing I want to do, because it takes me into the exercises, well, what happens if you don't use this word? Which is the latter part of what I'm going to do. I just want to give you a brief overview of what I've been up to in terms of the book I'm writing. I will better, I think, situate what the exercises I want to do. And I've discovered, when you think globally, historically and globally, and go back 5,000 years, there are a lot of words that make no sense. One of them, which is a totally hapless term, is modernization. It's another one of these things. You've got scholars who talk about modernization in ancient Rome, 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. We always joke in history, the middle class is always rising. And it's always modernizing. By the way, I come across works that insist in ancient Mesopotamia was capitalism. You start reading across time and space, and you realize some of these terms are just hapless. Modernization is one. The other difficult, and there's some others, development. I shy away from the use of that word too. It's something, things are happening and transforming. Development implies some progress, and I keep raising with my readers, progress for whom and on whose terms? So I've stopped using development, modernization. The key battle has been, and I'll show you the word globalization. We'll see how I battle with that, and of course the word capitalism. So let me just go through a little of what's sitting in this book, because it will speak to the exercises I'm going to go doing after I do that. And it's a little chapter by chapter blow but I'm going to do this quickly. This book does start, in the, as my wife says, in the Garden of Eden. Not quite. The first, part one, is called A Mercantilist Outpost. And it begins with a long chapter, a long excursion into economic world history, way back into ancient times. Basically, it's confirming a mouthful of an opening sentence that I have, that to understand anything that happens in North America, and then colonial North America, and then what becomes the new republic and seceding from the British Empire, the United States of America, is but a tiny, 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 tiny outgrowth of history that has been transpiring for a good 5,000 years. We're a tiny outgrowth, particularly of a exchange system that stretches from Nagasaki, Japan, to London, that actually emerges within the first millennium, an articulated exchange system of long-distance transfers of goods, people, there's trafficking in people going down back then, currencies, credit, ideas, and you can watch it articulated as really the time of the Greek Empire and then the Roman Empire. And it is a stretch of a commercial system involving East Asia, the Indonesian archipelago, Indian Ocean, Western Africa, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, around the Atlantic into Great Britain and even Ireland. And I start there and show how this existed. At one point, there's an imprint of Muslim traders on this. And I try to convince you that we are just a tiny outgrowth of something that's been millennia in the development. Okay, so that's the first chapter here. But I come to a time when there's an utter rupture to this commercial nexus in the 1400s with what, I won't go into it, the invention, a European invention of something we called mercantilism, and I go into this, which ruptures history, and does so because prior, this trading nexus, fully articulated, it is remarkable. Even the fixing of price millennia ago and value is that, which had been organized primarily by merchant communities, with a little background of either secular and state authorities intervening sometimes to arbitrate disputes, but as a world orchestrated by merchants, is ruptured by the nation-state building that happens in Europe, and mercantilism coming to build the wealth of nations by these rising sovereigns, deputizing trading groups to go colonize the rest of the world. And to me, mercantilism is the great rupture. So that the first part of this book is about the shift from what I call a mercantile form of globalization to a mercantilist form, with a rupture that occurs in which the means of this are utterly coercive, involving military power, and it had not been that, so much that before. I then spell a lot of this out in looking at all of the theorizing that goes on about the so-called rise of the West. I won't go into it, but there are reasons among historians to just dispute that there really was a rise of the West up until maybe 1900. And the intellectual quagmire that you see here. But the argument here is that among the intellectuals who deal with this issue, starting with Adam Smith and beyond, they've missed the power of mercantilism and its rupture. So that's what it's about. Then I take us into the Western Hemisphere and Western European colonization here, and to me the critical issue is labor supply. That's it. And it allows me to talk about slavery. A new form of slavery, actually. And then I just get us into the colonial states, and then that secessionist moment of the American Revolution, out of the British Empire and into we get out from under a mercantilist orb and can start writing a different history. Second chapter is called Envelopment, not development, but envelopment. And very, very quickly, This is what the 19th century is to me, not only about the United States, but globally. But I think we get into a period which often gets titles like the Industrial Revolution, the Transportation Revolution, the Market Revolution. To me, what the 19th century is about is a process I call envelopment, and it is a new stage in colonialization. I'm not sure it's a higher stage necessarily, where we begin to see the incorporation of resources, both natural and human resources, from hinterlands near and far into the metro-industrial centers of Western Europe and the northeast of America. And I watched this global incorporation out of frontiers, be it the US West, be it Australia, many parts of Africa, etc., of the incorporation of resources into the mechanism of industrialism and metro-industrialism. And that's what the 19th century is about. And it incorporates all of the titles, I think, in a more synthetic way than saying there's an industrial revolution, there's a transportation revolution. All these revolutions that supposedly are happening from a global standpoint, it is about the incorporation of resources, natural resources, foodstuffs to feed these burgeoning proletariats in these metro-industrial centers, and etc. And that takes me into a chapter about flows, about how industrialization is a product of flow, the kind of connectivities that are built because of international infrastructure developments in transportation and communication, the amazing institutionalization in financing that occurs with flows of credit, investment funds, and currency. And then I bring this story back to things we think about in the late 20th century, 19th century, our own Civil War, the economic crises that occurs, and the beginnings of the intervention of the state into all of this. That takes me to a third part called managing, because I show not only in the US but throughout the metro-industrial world, that process of envelopment and metro-industrialization creates crisis, economic crisis, almost yearly recessions, and certainly decade by decade, long-term economic depressions, as well as massive conflict, particularly between labor and people and their employers. And I see from about the 1870s, and it's not just in Western Europe, I can see it in Japan, Korea, and other places, this attempt at creating a more administrative order. I sound like Steve Bannon here, but a more managed world. And I see it first, so I start off with a new political economic order. I'll come back to that. I deal with, Greg Urban knows about this work, about the corporation creating order and among it with firms, the rise and entrenching of the corporation, and then the mobilizing of the state to quell economic and social disorder in various periods. I've got the Great Depression here. And then I wind up, after this inward turn, to create order within nations, an attempt, as in World War II, and particularly during World War II with Bretton Woods and other things, an attempt to actually manage the world economy. And I put that in question marks. Okay. And finally, I take us, as I keep writing, the present keeps on going about a year ahead, to the present, where, to me, if you want to understand anything about anything that's happened since 1945, it's about decolonization. And I try to show everything you can think about in all our crises are a function of the end of a 500-year history of Western European imperialism and what's created with that. It creates the new kind of chaoses of the world. Okay, so that's that background, that's that global background I find to even explaining, and it's very easy, you see this in the press, the kind of new populisms that are emerging, etc. But that's what I go, the new form of globalization, challenges to the managerial order. And those are some of the titles I'll get back to. Okay? And there's a where to here. Now, I've done that not just to sell copies of a book when the thing comes out, but as a little prelude to some intellectual exercise I want to do with you starting now. Because, as I said, taking on this project of global history and finding myself in time periods and places I knew nothing about, but learned a lot about. You get into a terrible battle of words, and the words that you use so easily and fastly, really, you begin to question your invocation of those words. So one of the words, which is certainly part of the commonplace language and parlance of our times, is globalization. And this book is written with the notion that globalization ain't new. It ain't new. Right? Well, this book takes you back to the third millennium, the second millennium, the first millennium BCE, where you have extraordinary long-distance transfers of goods, people, ideas, credit, currency. And for me, the objective is not to say, oh, it's now it's globalization is the only form we have, or oh, we have a 19th century form of it. I think this has been part of human society way back. And to me, the issue is to find some language for this, some categorizations for this, and what I call forms of globalization. I don't use the word ages of globalization. I don't use the word phases of globalization. Those imply some kind of evolution, some stepward progress here. This is nothing stepward at all. And there's overlapping in these forms as well. And some of these things come out of tectonic shifts. They're almost unexplainable. Like mercantilism emerging and rupturing what had been going on for centuries in terms of mercantile commercial exchanges. So I've come up with three, and here, by the way, this isn't helpful because you still got the problem of language. So what are you going to call your forms? I know I'm right on the first three because I've got a good soundbite about them. Mercantile, I see there's a mercantile form of globalization, a mercantilist, a metro-industrial, and I think we're in a sort of decolonizing form of globalization now. I don't know if that's the proper term. It could be, I've played around with the term decentered form of globalization, so I'm still playing around with that term. So there's the intellectual exercise. So that's simple. What did I say here? A simple battle with words. And that came hard after all this learning, but to me it was simple. The real one was capitalism, which is really, really problematic. Even though I've invoked it dozens of times myself. I just want to go over even these three words are problematic. So I thought I understood, I had training in economics. I was an economic historian. The word what capital is. Capital to me is just a resource, an asset you currently have, which you don't eat and consume. You don't eat and consume it. A factory building or a machine that is available to you for the future production of wealth. That's what a capital asset is. And factory building, machine is classic, a tool is classic. So I know that. That's what I grew up on. It's an asset, a resource that you have to present, you don't consume. You don't need cash. You don't need a hammer. You don't need a lathe machine. And you've got it available to create wealth in the future. Okay, that's that. Well, that's good. That's good enough. And we know these things wear down, and that's why we can take the advantages of a capital depreciation. Okay, if you are so well economically fit to take advantage of capital depreciation. But my economist friends have really, and some of my sociology economist friends, really muddied the water here by now they put two adjectives in front of it. You're probably aware there's all sorts of theorizing about human capital. That asset of whatever expertise you have or education you have. And really muddying the water, and I suspect this term is probably used in anthropology right now, but the word social in front of it, you've got social capital, which I guess is the privileges you have in terms of who you know and the networking you are in, and the ability to speak articulately and make it in the world, etc. Well, this is muddy waters, so we ain't got human capital. So I thought capital was easy. I thought, gee, we really muddy the waters by putting adjectives in front of this one. And I suspect there are other words that people have put in front of this. All right, so that's muddy. Capitalist. Well, I used to think that's an easy one. Whoever owns that resource as that asset is a capitalist. And this becomes pretty problematic because is a feudal lord a capitalist? Is a slave master a capitalist? I don't know. There are a lot of scholars who say no, they are not. They're in a different stage of development. They're not capitalists. So that comes. And worst of all, capitalism. Okay. So as I've kind of ordered my class a little bit around the notion of let's interrogate this term. I've run some exercises and seminars, even in class. All right, let's go find some definitions. You can do it right here. You go on the web. And I bet you take 10 minutes, you'll find 12 to 15 different definitions. Okay. They tend to crowd around two ways of thinking it, and I've given you some examples here. So I see capitalism is referred to in terms of behavior or personality traits. You see the word capitalism used. So you get something, well, if you see people acting greedily, you can call that society capitalist, or we have capitalism. If you see people involved in inquisitive individualism, call it capitalism. There's a very famous scholar who finds that in the 1300s, the origins of capitalism, because he sees inquisitive individualism. Profit-seeking, that doesn't sound too bad. If you see people just relentlessly calculating material gain, like those guys in Wall Street right now, or at least their computer algorithms are moving on where can they get another penny in the next nanosecond, that's capitalism. On the other hand, if you look at one of the great theorists who tried to turn Marx on his head, Max Weber, who are his capitalists when you think about capitalism? What is it called? The Protestant ethos? What is the title of the book?
Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism.
Yeah, the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which I had to read about 5 different courses when I was in college, and also in graduate school. No! It's a very different personality trait, orientation, disposition. It's not about wildcatting, profiting at the nanosecond. It's about very austere, prudential behavior, so that you know you're been called. And that austere, prudential behavior aimed at saving accumulation of wealth and savings for future investment. That ain't rapacious individualism by the nanosecond. So that's a little confusing. Now, better maybe for all of us is, okay, there's a whole group of people, if you go into the definition, you search the web, you can find it that it's about structures of activity. It's not about the behavior or the personality trait. And you get all sorts of things here. This is a short list, by the way. This can go on and on and on. Well, if we've got an economy based on unfettered markets, call it capitalism. By the way, having studied this for a time, there's no place ever on earth where you see unfettered markets. It's impossible. The only place you see it is in Micro 1, in the econ lecture where you have the intersection of supply and demand curves. That's the only unfettered market you will ever see. There's something, first of all, even the economists know that people come into these negotiations with asymmetric information, so it's not unfettered from the very beginning. The sanctity of private property, yeah, that sounds right. But like to be in ancient Rome, and we already have principles of private property here. Is that capitalist? Is that capitalism? The rule of law, got a lot of people saying that. He's a lot of people pointing to the 1400s, 1500s, the coming of real contractual dealings, the creation of real contracts, which then get the legal backing and sanctification. That's capitalism. There's a lot of so-called institutional economists who, Douglas North, the Nobel Prize, who just economist is critical here, where he sees his development of institutional practices in the 1400s, 1500s. That's capitalism from him. It's not, by the way, the Protestant ethic. Weber's got the same century, but North is talking about something entirely different. And this is Douglas North. Institutionalized practices, reducing transit action and mitigating risk. That's all the institutional stuff. Double entry bookkeeping. Insurance, the development of risk management. Institutions of risk management. We're back in 1400s, 1500s. And, as Stu said to me, read Marx, what's the litmus test of capitalism? Show me an economy based on wage labor, I'll call that capitalist. Well, that's a post-1993. So there we are, folks. What are you going to do with this mess of explanations? Well, one of them is to say, who cares? And I take you to a wonderful quote here, some of you know, this is sort of what gets paraphrased of, if it walks like a duck, it is a duck. So there's a wonderful quote I'm going to give you of Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart in a case in 1964 where the Supreme Court ruled that the state of Ohio had erred in banning the showing of the great French cinematographer Louis Malle's film The Lover on the grounds that it violated Ohio laws prohibiting obscene and pornographic materials. It was overruled. The court ruled that the film was not obscene and was protected under the freedom of expression, First Amendment rights. The court did not, by the way, provide a definition of what is pornographic or obscene. And for the following reason, and Justice Stuart Potter put it like this because he wrote the ruling. I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced with a shorthand description of pornography. He had used the word obscenity before. And perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so. But I know when I see it, and the motion picture involved in this case is not that. I just know it when I see it. If it walks like a duck, it's a duck. You know what? I'm fine with that. If you just know it when you see it, and that's capitalism, go on and do it. But I don't know if that, it becomes in some ways more a rhetorical device than analytic. And I find very interesting today, this history of capitalism. Capitalism remains a rhetorical device of the left. It's so interesting how the business community and the right doesn't use that expression anymore. They've got all sorts of euphemisms. They worry that if you use capitalist, you get capitalists and then those fat, greedy robber barons come to people's mind. So if I read the Wall Street Journal and Forbes and all this, and you never see the word capitalism. It's often the beneficence of free market economies, the free enterprise system, any other euphemism. They haven't weaponized the word capitalism. They've weaponized other phrases. The left has weaponized the word capitalism and continues to do it. Okay, so what is the answer? Okay, answer number one, and I'm all for it, and I almost did this, is to put an adjective in front of capitalism. This is the solution to the definitional conceptual problem. And boy, you can have a long list of adjectives here. Mercantile capitalism. Mercantilist capitalism, industrial capitalism, boy did I use that phrase a lot in writing Industrializing America. Corporate capitalism, managerial capitalism, see that phrase? I see that phrase a lot. State capitalism, I guess that's maybe what the Chinese have, I don't know. Or state corporate capitalism, put two adjectives together if you want to feel about it. At one point in my lectures, I used to talk about state corporate bureaucratic capitalism. Load on the adjectives. Welfare capitalism. They envied about phrase. Finance capital. That you see even among financial people. There is a problem here. If we just tag an adjective or many adjectives to the word capitalism, there must be something similar or something unto all of them. What is it? What is it? I don't know. I don't know. So that left me in terms of, if I'm not going to use this, what am I going to do? And what is my readings far back in time, and of course, the globe, going to do with me? And I began thinking, one of the problems with invoking capitalism, it's a little bit of a problem in Marx, is a number of things get written out, and the state actually gets written out. And for a lot of Marxists, the state is epiphenomena, just the stalking horse for the capitalist class. The state is an active agent. The state has its own interest, and a lot of references to capitalism don't have the state. I need to bring the state back in. And that's when I decided, let me think in terms of political economy. An old phrase, by the way, but which one I have sort of butchered. And I think I had it in my blurb. And I want to find my blurb. I'll read it to you. Actually, that's what I have. Yeah. So what do I mean by political economy? And it's a very abstract level. At the moment, I'm calling it the nexus between the state, business enterprise, and labor. And that's what all these eras are about, this nexus between the state, business enterprise, and labor here. So I'm going to give you an example of a very important part of part 3. I don't know if you can see this in the back, but I'll read it, where I come to see this period from the 1870s, 1880s, right through World War II, remaking, a vast remaking of America. But I can see it in Sweden, I can see it in Great Britain, I can see it in other metro-industrial centers in response to the dislocation and tumult and conflict of metro-industrialism. And for the U.S. in particular, I see the slow building of a new building, if you have to use a metaphor, actually with no single architect, a lot of it done through convergences of groups of entirely different interests, creating a new political activity marked by these characteristics. Okay? And they're all put in place at different time periods. But this is America, the U.S., in 1945. None of this was there in 1880. Okay? So this to me is more important, but I have a problem with labels, that my readers understand we have a remaking in response to metro-industrialism that has these characteristics. None of it there in 1880. Corporate dominance of the economy and corporate political power, mass production and mass consumerism, bureaucratic procedures and institutions, accommodations between capital and labor. By the way, this one after 1940 is the first to go. And it's gone, really, in 2018. Government modulation of the economy through fiscal and monetary means, the manipulation of tax and interest rates. No one had that as policy. They didn't think about it. Government spending to maintain high levels of production and employment. State welfare policies aimed at placing a floor on social suffering and sustaining high purchasing power. That floor is still there, it's just a little lower. Very critically, this is a World War II phenomenon. Arms production as a foundation block of the economy. That's a World War II phenomenon and a Cold War continuation of it. And international military economic power. That's, to me, the new political economic order. And capitalism doesn't help me here. I don't know how many adjectives I'm going to have to add to put in front of capitalism to signify this. But I still have a labeling problem. What do I call this? What do I call it? I don't know. This is one of my battles. Is finding labels. I think I'm analytically right, but we've got a problem with labels here. And here I'm going to stop with one more slide. And so I could have American capitalisms. I do tell the reader false advertising, but I hope you bought the book because of the title. So I have U.S., forget the American, U.S. political economic orders. I'm really happy with my mercantilist period. I'm very happy with my metro-industrial period. I'm not quite sure I like the managed era, the administrative era, the institutionalist order. That's what some of my students is the wrong way. But this new order, and that's there, when I'm now in the decolonized world, I don't have a label for what I see as the characteristics of everything that has happened since 1945. And it often does get the word neoliberal comes up, or neoliberalism comes up here. And actually, I'm shying away from using that term. One of the reasons is, when I think about us in 2018, I find it pretty remarkable how much is still in place. There's been challenges to this. There's a challenge from the new left. There's a challenge, a continuing challenge from the right. There are challenges of the new form of globalization. But I think we're exactly where we were from 1946. So maybe I don't need a new title for the political economic world that we live in now. That's what I'm battling with my readers in the last part of this. A couple of things are going on. We do not have competitions between capital and capital. And that was erased really quickly. Really quickly. We still do have something of a floor of social confidence. And we still have a government which it's got to sustain client purchasing power will. Some people think this gives more money to the wealthy through tax breaks, and that will increase purchasing power. Keynesians would say give that all to the purchasers of goods, but that theory, that macro notion is still there. So that's where I am. In relinquishing, abandoning the term capitalism, suggesting that others might follow suit, or you can throw tomatoes at me. So I'm done. You can put the lights back up, and I'm willing. I went a little overboard, but I could say at least another half an hour for those who don't have to take off at 20 after to go to the next class. So the floor is open.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I need a little water here. And you might as well tell me your name.
Gordon. I am really intrigued by your suggestion of a new term, decolonization, or decolonizing economics. Sort of what I can't remember precisely the framing of it. That seems really unusual to me. I understand that you're trying to focus on the way that the nation state has been sort of decentered, the way that globalization has sort of blurred boundaries, etc. But when I think colonization, the salient point for colonization is not the nation state. It's something about sort of the movement of cultures and the movement of sort of force. And so I'm wondering what your reasoning is, or what your thinking is behind using that term.
Let me say something about colonization and the nation state. It sure does involve the nation state, because you have nation states using military coercion to take over these areas. Okay? Is there a cultural phenomenon attached to it? Yes. But I don't want to lose the coercive nature of Western European powers.
That
so there is a nation state. And mercantilism is all about building the wealth of nations, not the colonial nations. They're supposed to help build the wealth of the homeland nation. Metro-industrialism is different. What I think is happening in the 19th century, in that, sure, there are nation states or military backing up colonialization, but you're getting actors here who operate across boundaries. I'll give you one clear example. To me, one of the most critical agents in what I call metro-industrialization is Barings Bank of London, who couldn't care less about British Crown, who are the great investors in infrastructure development in Argentina, India, and around Mexico and around the world. You've got this kind of transnational forget finance capital at work here. So I just want to clarify about the nation state. Why? First of all, I don't say, I've played around with decolonizing and decolonization. Decolonization I don't like. It implies that, in fact, all the empires are gone. The former Western European and U.S. imperialists gave up their commands. They didn't. They still oversee great spheres of influence. They just don't have administrative states there as they did. So I like this decolonizing. Why do I think this is important? I just think the background to every crisis we've had since 1945 is that ending of Western European coercive and administrative control of 80 to 90% of the world. Okay? The land mass of the world, 80% of it is British. It was in the hands of the British. 80% of the land mass of the world was under British authority. Put in quotes. They still had to deal with local uprisings and local power sources. That undoing has made for a different world. And one of the most interesting two things I'll put why I think this is important. One is capital can flow in places it never could. Because of the Western European and U.S. imperial holds that prohibited other homeland nations from putting their investment capital elsewhere. Things opened up. And what also opened up was a reversal that in the old mercantilist and also metro-industrial systems, the promotion of homeland industry, home country industry was essential. Use those colonies to provide the resources and the markets for what you boosted the home country manufacturers and producers. Okay? And indirectly put a little lid on whatever social tension is going to be existing, particularly if you have a fermenting proletariat here. So you raise up empire will, and patriotism is for all of the benefits of the home country people, including its working classes. Okay?
But so in your
So
understanding,
when you pull that out,
the effects of, for instance, McDonald's or
let me get to
Apple,
yeah.
which are sort of, they're linked to a nation state, but they have sort of a different kind of coercive force in local economies. Those
Apple-
are utterly separate from a form of colonization for you.
Can I just get finished with this
Yeah,
statement?
sure.
What happens then for me in Western European countries is screw the working class. Screw the working class. And that's exactly what's happening to the working class. Unfortunately, you've got characters that can appeal to the working class and what's been done to them, not the history of that is. You don't have to say we have an empire, so our working class will be prosperous. Screw the working class. That's the biggest thing to me in Western Europe. It's just screw the working class. If there was such a thing as Apple in 1925, the British, with their spheres of influence and others in China, never would have allowed them in. It is the pulling out of that Western is allowing capital and companies. What is it allowed? Manufacture was centered in the homelands of the imperialist countries deliberately. They used the colonies for the purposes of building the wealth of nations in those home countries of the imperialists. You get rid of that system, manufacture could just move out of the home countries to whatever other peripheral areas, and that's exactly what happened. The movement of manufacture out of Philadelphia, well, it was a bad example, but out of the United States. Philadelphia is loss of manufacturing jobs is more complicated, but I said, to take manufacture out of the core and put it into peripheries, only allowable with the ending of the coercive administrative rule of Western European countries, and notably Great Britain, in that world. The Apple would never have gotten in there. The British state would never have allowed what is happening in India today. Never have allowed it. Ever. First of all, they wanted to keep them undeveloped. And two, they're certainly not going to get a lot of U.S. money in there. And that, to me, is what what's shifted dramatically, and we don't think about the impact of decolonization and a reversal of 500 years of history. That's what I have to say here. Now, it's a little more complicated, but that's what I'm trying to create as a background to part 4. Start there. And you know, we're left with the residues. In the 21st century, we're left with the residues of Western European culture. Those goddamn maps that imperialists draw became countries in which you had groups who have been warring for ages into one nation state. And look at all the civil unrest in the Middle East, West Africa, because of what they created, the lines they drew in Whitehall to create a nation, which was the nation. We're going to be late into the 21st century still dealing with that residue. Think about Palestine and Israel. That is a residue of imperialism. And we're going to deal with it forever. We're dealing with the absolute residues of imperialism today. And then we lifted certain boundaries and allowed capital to go to places it could never have gone before. And shifted the manufacturing sector out of the core. I don't like core peripheries. This is Wallerstein. I don't like Wallerstein for many, many reasons. Because those peripheries were not backward. They were not backward at all. They were engines, economic engines, but economic engines under the grasp of the Western imperialists. So I'm aware of that word peripheries. They were really economic engines. As to cultural imperialism, we got something a little different here, the Coca-Colaization of the world and stuff like that. I actually deal with that in my under consumerism in my part 3 of the creation of consumer mentality, and it does have a global aspect to it. I see that. How are you?
I loved your talk because I have long believed that capitalism is an analytically useless word, except I did not know, and you have shown me, the historical time depth of reasons. We give you examples of Mesopotamia and all the rest of it, which gives me much greater clarity about that whole set of issues that you're discussing. But the reason why, you see, one of the issues about the word capitalism is that it has what the literary critic Bakhtin called a voicing structure, right? That is to say, of course it's analytically useless, it's complete fluff as far as I'm concerned, I couldn't agree with you more. But the question is, why is it so trenchant? Why are people so caught up in it, right? So to give you an idea of what I mean by this, is that the question that I ask is not what capitalism is, but when did the noun capitalism acquire teeth? That's the question, right? And one awfully good answer is that it happened after Marx. But of course, the word capitalism had not acquired legs right after Marx, right? Marx uses the word capitalist, and for Marx, them's fighting words, right? I mean, he's basically, Weber points out that although Weber invented the term ideal type, Marx is full of ideal types. Marx, in fact, uses them relentlessly, and part of Weber's critique of Marx is that they're the wrong ideal type, right? But so he constructs this caricature called the capitalist, to which he attributes all kinds of mental states, greed, all of that. And of course, Marx is fighting his own battles, which is a wonderful battle. Of course, I'm very sympathetic to it in many ways. The hideousness of mid-19th century theorize that. All of that is fabulous, one of the fabulous things in Marx. But my story is not about Marx. My point is that, okay, the word capitalism acquires, or capitalist acquires a certain kind of teeth, but it's still a bookish kind of teeth. You have to work through the tomes of capital to even discover
Yeah,
that it
yes.
So that's just the first step. The next step is that it's really after October 1917 that the word capitalism begins to acquire not just teeth in a certain sense, but legs. Not immediately after 1917. One of the very interesting things that Schumpeter, in his 1,000-page History of Economic Analysis says, is that during Adam Smith's own life, no one would have considered him an even especially important writer. It was just that his book was a runaway bestseller, it went all over Europe, but no one would have thought that he was the father of capitalism at all.
Absolutely.
And that really, Adam Smith became Saint Adam, in other words, the founding father, for a totally different set of reasons, which is that he was a big promoter of laissez-faire.
Yeah, actually not if you read The Wealth of Nations.
I agree with you. I agree with you there too. But he is held up as the right. And it's really after communism and even Keynesianism, actually, you don't even have to go as far as communism. Keynesianism had emerged by the 20s and 30s and so forth. That those people who were really laissez-faire ideologues, right, needed another noun with both teeth and legs, which could then become the emblem that they would hold up, right?
Yeah.
And so since then, so in other words, the voicing structure of this term, and then afterwards, of course, it becomes part of the everyday currency of usage of so many people, that all kinds of things kind of get squished into it and all the rest of it, right? So in some ways, the kind of dilemma that you're facing in what appears to be an absolutely wonderful book, the kind of terminological dilemma that you're facing, it seems to me, is that even after you've demonstrated the descriptive inadequacy of the term, and you've already, given us a little sketch of that, it strikes me that from the point of view of completing your argument or being able to proceed with confidence, you would need to give some description, perhaps not a long description, of this issue, right?
Yeah.
Of the political emblem that using the word token, capitalism or capitalist, in the sense of I am one, I am for it, that if you give that counterfeit, that would both explain why it still persists and will no doubt continue to persist in contemporary usage. And you see what I'm saying? So it strikes me that might be a thing to add to.
I think you're exactly right. There's this section in the introduction which has been, I was going to give it to you, but I've rewritten it so many times that I didn't, call this Battle with Words. And I think it's a really good place to do that, and I haven't. So I'm going to take this very seriously under advisement. A couple of things I just want to respond to you. I also absent from the text, not from a very long bibliographic essay, are names of the famous, the venerable, which is really hard. Try to write an economic history without mentioning Adam Smith or Karl Marx or John Maynard Keynes. Now, actually, Keynes is the only one I do come up because he's so identified with a certain macroeconomic policy, and there's no substitute for it. But in my bibliographic essay, one of the things I raise with my reader, if you raise on high someone like Adam Smith, my reaction is, which Adam Smith? Because even if you plow through The Wealth of Nations, it's not a laissez-faire tome whatsoever. It's a tome about the beneficence of competition and some of the encumbrances of having a mercantilist economy. Even though he even admits mercantilism is critical historically. By the way, the person who really admits mercantilism is historically, it's buried in Keynes's theory were in an appendix. I was glad to come across it because it kind of emphasized what I was doing. He thinks materialism is the key critical shift in human economic activity. So I often say which Adam Smith, because there's the wonderful Adam Smith from the first volume, The Sentiments, which is this is all about the trust we have with each other as humans, which is the only way you can carry on economic transactions. Same thing as which Marx. I mean, there are thousands, there are Marxists and Marxists. So I do this thing in the appendix, and which Keynes for that matter, by the way. So that's one of the reasons I drop names from the text, but do this scorecard at the end. You raise something which has got my questions up, because you're right, and I wish I knew more. And I'm thinking of the lot I know about working class protests in the United States. It's very interesting when it emerges in the late 19th century and into the 1930s. It's other words. I know that cartooning has the fat-bellied, Tweed's fat-bellied capitalist chomping on a cigar with money all over him. But when I look, and I got to go back at this, and it's so easy to do this digitally today, to go word searching. The words that come up, interestingly, even into the 1930s, are words such as plutocrat, magnate, rob a baron. It's not necessarily capitalist, even within labor protest movements. When capitalists does, I've got to find out that too. And Roosevelt uses that. By the way, when Roosevelt goes after his detractors, he's going after the plutocrats. He's not going after the capitalist class. But the other thing, I agree with you that the sanctification of competitive market economies is not the guru. It's Hayek and Sons. It's Hayek and Sons. But even the business community today shies away from, there may be some business mogul, a mogul, by the way. Yes. It is a South Asian term, they'll use mogul. Even today, you'll have a lone mogul who will call himself proudly a capitalist, but the press, the business press, finds every euphemism not to use that. And I think in the back of the mind, it was like people used to use that when they were defending socialism or something like that. By the way, you can do for socialism the same thing I do with capitalism. It is a many-splendid thing. There's so many versions of socialism also. But I like this, and I've got to think more about it, is when does it become, I use the word weaponized.
Yes, that's a good word, yes.
I don't know. Well, thank
Maybe
you.
it's not the right word to use in print, but it's a good word to think of it.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
So Walter, can I build on that
Thank
just
you.
a little bit? With the circulation of discourse is also circulation of consciousness that goes with it. So I think part of Asif's point is taking us into this issue, why now does capitalist become a term that seems to capture imagination, that seems to reflect what's happening in the world today. Whatever the historical antecedents, the circulation is actually quite interesting from that point of view, because it does, as you point out, and as your the roundtable on the new capitalist history and so forth points out, that there's something going on that is making that term, as Asif was saying, have legs, and it does seem to have something to do with an outlook on things. There are, by the way, some chairs of capitalism, Glenn probably knows this, in business schools. The word is out there. So it's been a little bit moved into that area, but you're right, it is primarily outside of that area that the term circulates.
It just reminded me, when I was in graduate school, PhD in Princeton, some right-wing businessman gave Princeton a chair in capitalism. And they refused to use that word, so it was something in the... It's got a long title, The Chair and the Beneficence of Market Economies. It goes on and on and on and on.
But there is capitalism and freedom, Milton Friedman.
Yes, well, it's Hayek and Sons.
Yeah.
Sons, well, no, Anna Schwartz, sorry, capital, Yeah. Well, it does take a global crisis to get. There is, in terms of the history of capitalism, it's fed by the global crisis, and I'm afraid it's also fed by the publishing industry.
Yeah.
Why were they all looking to create series when that took that time? Sell books. But I'm going to have to deal with it, and I agree with you.
But in terms of circulation, by the way, also, go back to Adam Smith, Marx, obviously the word capital is the central one, and that's...
Capitalism,
yes,
not capitalism.
Right, no, I know, I totally understand that.
You
And
cannot find
I think
capitalism
the orientation that is defined by capitalist is an orientation to capital in the senses that were being used in a fairly long history.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you. Question?
Thank you for your presentation. We started the world history beginning with like a bunch of people we may call it merchant. That's the like an origin of mercantilism. Like merchant moving things, products, goods, whatever we call it around the world. That kick off the global connection or the globalization. And
my first form of globalization.
yeah, like
I don't want to call it the first age of
but like
globalization.
we don't deny that it's a kind of like there's a deep history in globalization.
Right, yes.
But like and we distinguish the mercantilism from those previous versions of that kind of like merchant practices by how and who this group who are this group of merchants and how they manage to like circulate goods around the world.
Yeah.
And then my question is like
That's a good question all by itself.
then my question is like there is it looks like if we look from like a global perspective, there is a heterogeneous meaning in what is good, what is the stuff that are being moving around. There's a different meaning at each single place in the world who engage in this global activity. Then go back to capital. The problem with the capitalism and capital, that is, capital is not necessarily regarded as capital in some place at some like historical time for some certain group of people, which kind of I see it like merchant and mercantile seem to share this kind of heterogeneity with capital. Then what do you think is the strength of replacing capital with merchants or like merchandise?
Okay.
That's my question.
Okay. I'll say the following. How did it happen? Through practice is one of the answers. One sees very slowly, and it takes centuries of the accumulation of knowledge and the creation of networks, not of single merchants, but of collectivities of merchants, and often family-based collectivities of merchants. Eventually, the Muslims have a system of a brotherhood of believers who form the nexus for those things. And you can slowly watch over time the beginning of the building up of trust through practice and failure of groups who begin to take hold on a trade network, okay? It's not global. It's not that the person in Canton is roaming around the earth plying their wares. The person in Canton in 1000 BCE may be working with someone on the Indonesian archipelago and things going like this. In the Indonesian archipelago, it's shuttling. There's a shuttling. So they're not roaming around the earth. They're developing with chains, let's call it like that, chains of commercial transaction. And it takes centuries of knowledge. First of all, it takes centuries of knowledge about, if you're on the transoceanic about currents and winds and what kind of ships can bear this kind of transport. That's centuries of knowledge. But the century of building up of agents, you know, economists would say, yes, there's a principal agent problem, but it takes practice to create the reliable, trustworthy agents who, yes, you can put together a ship full of stuff and get it over to the eastern side of India, and knowing there's someone there who will take it, who will valorize it for local commerce, and eventually send something back in return. And so we've got this remarkable networks of merchants who emerge over centuries, that allow, if what is passing is important, these are not bulk items. This is a commerce of exotic goods. And largely, for what I call the appetites of elites, so it's lacquerware out of China. It's these spices, the lower orders are never going to get access to the spices. So it is it's largely an exotic goods, and with a small consumer class of them at the point of consumption. So I don't think of these as bulk goods. Even of course, China, the silk trade. There wasn't one caravan that went all the way from Mongolia to Baghdad. There was a change. There was a change in the development of agents along these chains. It happened transoceanically as well as inland. And so how did it happen? By practice, centuries of practice, gaining knowledges, and particularly some technological wherewithal. How can these goods get there? It could take 8 months, but they got there before it spoiled. So that's that first question you had, how did it happen? Over time, with practice, I think it's my answer. You did have the intervention of courts when there were disputes, and it usually was most often a clerical court of some kind. A religious court would say you treated your agent unfairly. You didn't return what in fact the value of this was. And sometimes they were secular courts. But I am struck, even by 1000 BCE, before we have a Greek Empire, Roman Empire, the extent how articulated this was. And you could have a piece of jade wind up in Athens with value attached to it. Through turbulent terrains, no quick communication sources. And it takes centuries to develop. But it's
not my question.
well, you asked me how did it happen. I said,
It's not how it happened.
okay. So what's the question?
How it happened. If we want to give it a label to it, we need to formulate a kind of understanding of they have their own understanding of what is good, what is product, what is the kind of luxury China they are bringing from China to Europe. There's a bunch of meaning in that thing. They are circulating around the world. But the understanding of that meaning is everywhere different. So the Chinese Empire will not understand the thing they export
Yes.
equivalently as the one that equally as people in Europe receive that China. And that's for merchant's practice, we call it a practice, but it's a practice with meaning that has heterogeneous meaning, that is no different from, that's not much different from the conundrum of capitalism we face today, because we have a plural form of capitalism, a plural form of capitalistic practice. And my question is then what is the strength and what is the advantage advantage of like moving from like the discourse on capitalism and capitalistic practice and capital to mercantilism, mercantile and merchants?
Well, you're heading in the direction of just putting an adjective in front of capitalism. So if you want to call that mercantile capitalism, fine. But you're going to have to tell me, what do you mean by capitalism?
No, I'm not putting it like as an adjective. I mean, capitalism is an idea that includes like how capital should be. What is capital? How should it be appropriated? So it's like mercantilism. Like what is the good being circulated? Who are doing that? What is the meaning of it? But like no matter what kind of system we use to describe this certain, no matter what kind of like system or ontology is used, it's heterogeneous everywhere in the globe.
Oh, yeah. I agree with you.
Long-term will remain
Yeah.
because it's heterogeneous, and we want to use one system.
Well, that's an interesting thing about why certain things get valued and certain things don't get valued, and that shifts over time. And one of the things that happens is if you apply something which nobody wants, it's not valued anymore. And that's what I say, this is centuries of practice, because you begin to get to know what is valued or what can become valued. Now, in this early era, again, we're talking about exotic things. It's a transport of light exotic things. It's not bulk traffic and wheat and things. There's some bulk traffic of wheat in the Mediterranean, but these are exotic things that are easily transported without major shipping. And there probably were things that wound up in Baghdad that nobody wanted, and that word would spread back, don't send this stuff. And then the idea that this was centuries of articulated, the practices become articulated.
I think, so I don't want to try to reinterpret your question.
I've got to go in about 2 minutes.
Okay.
5 minutes, sorry.
To break it down in 2 sentences, if you were replacing mercantilism, or replacing capitalism with the term mercantilism for a specific period, what is, in 50 years, is there going to be someone who says mercantilism is a time to abandon the term? Does that make sense? It's sort of,
But the thing is,
is that kind of what you're asking? Okay.
well, mercantilism, first of all, mercantilism is one thing too, and it's very easy to define. And people who, we're tracks on mercantilism in the sense that we have the wealth of nations, which is a tract, competitive market economies. But I don't have a hard time define mercantilism if you want to. It's a political economic order that aims at the wealth of a nation through various practices. And one is you have a rising sovereign who wants to build not only the wealth of his nation, but the wealth of his own coffers. And he does that by deputizing chartered trading companies. Okay? Those trading companies are empowered to colonize through coercive means, military means, regions of the world that can supply resources, natural resources, for home country manufacture and act as markets for home country manufacture, as well as that activity of these merchants can be administered and taxed. Okay? At port cities that are under this mercantilist control. And that helps build the coffers of the country. And the last element of mercantilism, and this is sort of this bullion theory, is that today we call it a trade balance, that there should be more income coming in than out of the country. Because the mercantilists felt there is a limited contained supply of Coca-Cola, which would have been overserved. So mercantilism is explained, it's a set of practices, but at heart it's a way of building the wealth of the nation, orchestrated by the state or a rising sovereign through the deputization of trading groups. So that definition is not going to change. If you ask me, will the definition change? or will it be challenged with the title for a way of ruling all the nations?
But what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're saying that mercantilism is really a technical, almost a technical term, while capitalism is not. So you can always, it always will go with like a specific ideology, just like feminism. Like feminism, what is so? It always has to go with a specific time, like a specific time and a specific ideology.
Yeah, but that's one of the problems that I could read through the literature, and there are historians who absolutely claim that the capitalism was practiced in ancient Mesopotamia. That's nuts.
They say that also about
It's
feminism.
a historic. And then, if that's so, what is there, some genetic component to this? Is the capitalist gene we're carrying around with us?
Truck trade and barter, I think, is what.
But I wish I had that quote. You know, everybody, Hayek and company, quote that, Adam Smith. They don't give it the last part of that sentence. You know what the last part of that sentence is?
No.
To which I have no understanding of why that happens. He does not see that as essentialist to humankind. Where my students who take my class do believe greed is genetic. They won't say it like that, but it is what it is. Greedy at heart. And
So
essentially.
Dr. Licht has to go.
I gotta go.